Before we begin, take a moment to notice how still everything is around you right now. The world outside is moving, as it always does, but where you are, in this quiet space between waking and sleep, time works differently. And it is in that in-between space, the place where memory blurs into myth, and myth blurs back into memory, where tonight's story lives. Because what you are about to hear is not simply a Bible story. It is not simply a legend. It is something stranger, and more unsettling, and more beautiful than either of those words can hold. It is a question that the entire human race seems to have been asking, independently, simultaneously, for thousands of years, without any of them knowing the others were asking it. And that question is this: what if the world really did almost end? What if the water really did come? And what if somewhere, in some valley, or on some mountain, or beneath some ancient sea, the proof of it is still waiting to be found? Every great story begins before it begins. Before Noah ever appeared in a single line of scripture, before the Hebrew text of Genesis was compiled, before the name of God was written in any human language, there was another man. He lived in ancient Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the region that is today the country of Iraq. His name was Utnapishtim. He received a warning. A god came to him and told him that a flood was coming, a flood so total and so absolute that nothing alive on the surface of the earth would survive it. He was told to build a vessel, a great boat, and to fill it with the seed of every living thing. He did what he was told. The waters came. The waters covered everything. And when the waters finally receded, the boat came to rest on the peak of a mountain, and Utnapishtim sent out birds to test whether the land was dry enough to live on again. First a dove, which returned, then a swallow, which returned, then a raven, which did not return, because it had found dry land. And Utnapishtim knew that the world had survived, and that he and his family, and the animals he had carried, were the reason why. If that story sounds familiar to you, it should, because the story of Utnapishtim is older than the Bible, older than the book of Genesis, by at least 1,000 years. It was written on clay tablets in the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian languages, and those tablets are now in museums in London and Berlin and Baghdad, and scholars have been reading them for over a century and a half. The most complete version appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature ever recovered from the ancient world, a 12-tablet poem about a king named Gilgamesh who goes searching for the secret of eternal life and finds, instead, the story of the one man who survived the flood. The flood narrative, embedded inside the Epic of Gilgamesh, predates the Genesis account by at so minimum 500 years, and possibly by 1,000 years or more. Both stories feature a righteous man, warned by a divine being. Both feature the building of a massive boat. Both feature a catastrophic flood that destroys everything. Both feature birds sent out to test for land. Both end with the boat coming to rest on a mountain, and a new beginning for humanity. Scholars do not dispute this. It is not a fringe theory. It is one of the most thoroughly established facts in all of comparative mythology and ancient, Near Eastern studies. The question has never been whether the stories are connected. They clearly are. The question that has kept archaeologists, geologists, theologians, and ordinary people arguing for more than a century is deeper and more interesting than that. The question is where the connection comes from. Did the writers of Genesis borrow the story from Mesopotamian tradition? Did both accounts independently preserve the memory of a real event? And if there was a real event, what was it? When did it happen? Where did it happen? And is there any physical evidence that it left behind? Those questions are what make this story so extraordinary to sit with on a quiet night, because the answers, the partial answers, the competing answers, the answers that raise more questions than they resolve, are more strange and more compelling than most people ever learn. And they begin not in the Middle East at all, but in the mountains of eastern Turkey, on the slopes of a volcano called Ararat, where something has been waiting in the rock for a very long time. Mount Ararat rises to a height of 16,800 feet above sea level, on the border between Turkey and Iran. It is the highest point in all of Turkey, a dormant stratovolcano covered in permanent ice and snow, visible on clear days from 3 countries at once. For centuries, it has been considered by Armenian and Christian tradition to be the resting place of Noah's Ark. The Book of Genesis says the Ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, a region rather than a specific peak, but the identification of Ararat with this specific volcano has been fixed in religious geography for well over 1,000 years, and the searches for the Ark on its slopes have been going on for almost as long. Marco Polo passed through the region in the 13th century and noted the local belief that the Ark was preserved somewhere on the mountain, its wood kept intact by the permanent ice. A Dominican friar named Jordanus visited in the 14th century and made the same report. An Armenian monk named Jacob of Memtsketa claimed in the 14th century to have reached the Ark and broken off a piece of wood from it, which he kept as a sacred relic. None of these accounts produced physical evidence, but they kept the idea alive, generation after generation, that something was up there, frozen in the glaciers, waiting. The modern era of serious Ararat expeditions began after a French aviator named Fernand Navarre claimed in 1955 to have found ancient hand-hewn timber buried in the ice near the Teng. As he brought back samples, radiocarbon dating placed the wood somewhere between the 5th and 9th centuries of the Trains. Common Era, far too recent to be biblical. But Navarre's claim attracted international attention and launched a wave of expeditions in the following decades. American astronaut James Irwin, who had walked on the moon, led 2 separate Ararat expeditions in the 1980s, searching for the Ark. He found nothing conclusive. A retired naval officer named John Morris made more than a dozen attempts on the mountain over the several decades. A Turkish-American team announced in 2010 that they had found wooden structures inside a cave near the summit, and that carbon dating placed them at around 4,800 years old, which would align with some calculations of the biblical flood date. Experts were skeptical. The wood could not be independently verified. The story did not hold. And then there is the Durupinar Formation, 18 miles south of Mount Ararat. In a remote valley near the Turkish-Iranian border, there is a geological structure that has the shape of a boat. Not vaguely, not if you squint at it from the right angle. It has the clear, unmistakable outline of a vessel, 538 feet long, with a distinct prow, and a flattened bottom, and a raised symmetrical form that does not look like anything the surrounding landscape would naturally produce. A Kurdish farmer discovered it in 1948 after a series of earthquakes and heavy rains shifted the soil and exposed the structure beneath. An American military pilot named Ilhan Durupinar photographed it from the air in 1959, and the images were published in Life magazine, causing a worldwide sensation. Biblical scholars and geologists descended on the site. The initial excitement cooled. Geologists concluded that the formation was most likely a natural fold in the earth, a place where geological pressure had pushed layers of rock into a curved shape that happened to resemble a boat. The site was largely forgotten for several decades. Then, in the 1980s, a researcher named Ron Wyatt began investigating the Durupinar Formation more intensively, and claimed to have found evidence of internal structure, regular spacing of what he interpreted as the ribs of a wooden vessel fossilized into the rock, and a chemical signature in the soil consistent with the decomposition of organic matter. His work attracted enormous popular attention, but significant scientific skepticism. In 2024 and 2025, the investigation was taken up by a formal international research team, including scientists from Istanbul Technical University, Agri Ibrahim Seçen University, and Andrews University in the United States. They analyzed 30 soil samples taken from around and within the formation. What they found was striking even to skeptical observers. The samples contained traces of marine deposits, clay-like materials, consistent with ancient flooding, remnants of marine organisms, including mollusks, creatures that live in the sea, and whose presence in a mountain valley has to be explained. The team's findings were presented at the 7th International Symposium on Mount Ararat and Noah's Ark. They did not claim definitively that the Durupinar Formation is Noah's Ark, but they said the evidence of ancient flooding at the site, dating to approximately 5,000 years ago, was compelling enough to warrant continued serious investigation. The debate continues. A geologist named Lawrence Collins published detailed research arguing that the formation is entirely the result of natural erosion, that its boat-like shape is an accident of geology, and that the supposed internal structures Wyatt identified are simply natural rock formations. The team investigating the site points to the marine deposits and the dimensions, which at 538 feet closely match the 300 cubits given in the Genesis text. No resolution has been reached. The mountain keeps its silence. But here is the thing about Mount Ararat, and about the Durupinar Formation, and about every expedition that has ever set out to find a wooden boat on the slopes of a Turkish volcano. Even if something is up there, even if the ice does contain the preserved timbers of an ancient vessel, even if the Durupinar Formation does turn out to be something more than a natural fold of rock, that finding, remarkable as it would still not answer the deeper question, because the deeper question is not whether Noah's Ark existed. The deeper question is whether Noah's flood happened. And to answer that question, you have to look somewhere else entirely. You have to look at the stories themselves. All of them, not just the one in Genesis. All 300 of them, 350 to be precise. That is the number of independent flood legends that scholars have catalogued from cultures around the world. Stories about a great flood that destroyed or nearly destroyed humanity, told in the oral and written traditions of civilizations that had no known contact with each other. The Greeks told the story of Deucalion, a righteous man warned by the god Zeus that a flood was coming, who built a chest and filled it with provisions and floated on the waters for 9 days and 9 nights, until the waters receded, and he found land on the slopes of a mountain. The Hindu tradition preserves the story of Manu, a primordial man warned by a fish that a flood was coming, who built a ship and was towed to safety by the fish, which revealed itself to be the god Vishnu in his first avatar. The Aztecs told of a man named Tapi, who was warned by his god Tezcatlipoca to build a boat and fill it with 1 pair of every animal. The native peoples of North America, from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains to the Gulf Coast, all have flood traditions. The indigenous peoples of Australia have flood traditions. The peoples of Southeast Asia, of Polynesia, of Africa, of China, all have them. Versions of the story appear in the traditions of cultures on every inhabited continent. The conventional scholarly explanation is diffusion. Stories travel with people. Trade routes carry not just goods, but narratives. The ancient Near Eastern flood story originated in Mesopotamia, spread through the ancient world along the paths of migration and commerce, and arrived in cultures far from its origin, wearing local clothing. That is a reasonable explanation for why similar stories appear in cultures that had historical contact with the ancient Near East. It becomes considerably less convincing as an explanation for why flood legends appear in the oral traditions of peoples in Australia, in the Americas, in the Pacific Islands, in places that had no possible historical contact with ancient Mesopotamia. For those traditions, something else must account for the similarity. Either the human imagination in widely separated places independently invented the same basic story, which is possible but seems unlikely given how specific the parallels often are, or something happened, something real, something catastrophic enough to burn itself into human memory in a way that survived for thousands of years across thousands of miles of separation to emerge eventually in stories that have the same shape, even when they have different names, and different gods, and different local details. And here, finally, is where the science becomes extraordinary. The world looks different from the end of the last ice age. Before you can understand anything about what happened to water in the ancient world, you have to understand what was happening to ice. The last great glaciation, the period when massive ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, reached its peak roughly 22,000 years ago. The ice sheets over North America were 3 miles thick in places. The ice over Scandinavia reached south into what is now Germany. So much of the Earth's water was locked up in ice that global sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. 400 feet. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between coastlines that look like what we see on maps today and a world with hundreds of thousands of square miles of dry land that does not exist anymore. The coastlines of Europe and Asia and the Americas in the depths of the Ice Age bore almost no resemblance to what we see on a modern globe. Then the ice began to melt. The warming happened in phases, with periods of rapid melt interspersed with periods of temporary cooling, but the general trend over the 12,000 years following the glacial maximum was one of inexorable warming and rising seas. Sea levels rose as the ice melted, but they did not rise smoothly or gradually. They rose in pulses, in episodes of sudden acceleration, when major ice sheets collapsed. One such pulse, around 14,600 years ago, raised global sea levels by roughly 60 feet in fewer than 500 years. Another major pulse occurred around 11,500 years ago. The rising waters reshaped the world over and over again, across millennia, drowning coastlines, swallowing river valleys, converting peninsulas into islands and islands into seamounts, turning shallow seas into deep ones. Most of this happened too slowly for any single human lifetime to perceive, but some of it did not happen slowly. Some of it happened catastrophically, and the most catastrophic, well-documented example is what happened to the Black Sea. 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea was not the body of salt water it is today. It was a freshwater lake, substantially smaller than the current sea, sitting in a basin that was cut off from the Mediterranean. Its shoreline was lower by as much as 80 to 100 meters than the level of the Black Sea today, which means there was significantly more dry land surrounding it than there is now. People lived on the shores of the Black Lake, as we might call it. They farmed the fertile lowlands around its edges. They built communities there. They were there when the disaster happened. The Bosporus, the narrow strait that today connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and, ultimately, to the Mediterranean, was not open 7,600 years ago. It was sealed, a natural dam holding the Black Lake separate from the rising waters of the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean was rising as the ice continued to melt and global sea levels continued to climb. The dam held, and then one day, it did not hold. Two geologists from Columbia University, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, proposed in 1997 what they called the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. Their argument, built on evidence from seafloor sediment cores and the remnants of ancient shorelines they mapped with soundwave equipment, was that the Bosporus Dam failed catastrophically around 5600 BCE, that the Mediterranean Sea water poured through the breach at a rate more than 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls, and that within months to years, the level of what had been the freshwater Black Lake rose by somewhere between 60 and 100 meters, swallowing an area of coastal land roughly the size of a small European country. The fresh water was rapidly displaced by salt water. The freshwater mollusks that had lived in the lake died and were buried in a layer of sediment. The marine organisms of the Mediterranean moved in. The community of scientists drilling cores from the Black Sea floor found exactly this pattern: a layer of freshwater mollusk shells capped by a layer of saltwater species, the geological equivalent of a before and after photograph. Ryan and Pittman believed that the people who had been farming those drowned shorelines fled in by every direction, carrying with them the memory of the catastrophe. That memory, they argued, traveled with migrants into Mesopotamia, into Anatolia, into the Caucasus, into Europe, and over 3,000 years of oral tradition eventually crystallized into the flood narratives of ancient Mesopotamia and ultimately into the book of Genesis. The hypothesis is not universally accepted. Other geologists have argued that the inflow was gradual rather than catastrophic, that the Bosporus connection did not open in one dramatic event, but slowly over time. The debate in the scientific literature is real and ongoing. What is not disputed is the underlying geological fact. The Black Sea did flood. The shorelines are there, drowned under the water. The sediment layers are there, readable in the cores. Something happened to the Black Sea around 7,600 years ago that permanently and dramatically altered its size, its salinity, and its relationship to the land around it. Whether that event was sudden enough to generate the kind of traumatic human memory that would produce flood legends across a region is the question that scientists are still working to answer. But the Black Sea is only one candidate, because the same basic geological story of low sea levels during the Ice Age, followed by dramatic coastline loss as the ice melted, plays out around the entire world. The Persian Gulf was mostly dry land during the glacial maximum. The shallow Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, which is now covered by up to 300 feet of ocean, was a vast continent-sized landmass, connecting mainland Southeast Asia to the islands of Indonesia, a place where human civilizations might have flourished for tens of thousands of years before the rising seas swallowed the coastlines. The same is true off the coasts of India, of Australia, of the Gulf of Mexico. All around the world, the coastlines that human beings first settled, the lowland river, valleys and the fertile coastal plains where the first agricultural communities took root, are now underwater. The human communities that lived in those places in the millennia around the end of the Ice Age watched the water come, generation by generation, year by year, sometimes suddenly and catastrophically, sometimes slowly enough that it was barely perceptible in a single lifetime, but impossible to ignore across several generations. And that is the most extraordinary thought you can hold about flood legends, the one that makes every version of this story resonate differently when you hear it. What if all of those 300 flood traditions, the ones from Mesopotamia and Greece and India and Australia and the Americas, are not copies of each other at all? What if they are all independent memories of a real experience that the entire human species shared? Not one flood, many floods. Not one catastrophe, many catastrophes played out over thousands of years of Ice Age melting in every coastal community that ever existed in the ancient world. What if the flood is in our memory, not because one man named Noah or Utnapishtim or Deucalion or Manu survived, but because all of our ancestors lived through something like it, in different places, at different times, and the memory of water coming and the world changing and everything being lost never quite went away. The Gilgamesh story is worth pausing on for a long moment because it is the most complete version of the ancient flood narrative we have from a pre-biblical source, and the details in it are specific enough to be startling. When the god Ea warns Utnapishtim of the coming flood, he tells him to build a vessel of precise dimensions. The vessel in the Gilgamesh epic is described as having a floor space of 1 acre, with 6 decks, creating 7 levels, and it is sealed inside and outside with bitumen, which is the ancient word for pitch or tar. The Genesis account of Noah's Ark says the same thing almost word for word, that Noah was instructed to cover the ark with pitch. Utnapishtim loads the vessel with gold, silver, the seed of all living things, his family, and the craftsmen who helped him build the boat. He describes the storm in terms that any reader today would recognize as a description of something far beyond ordinary rain. a darkness so total that the gods themselves were afraid of it, a noise like war, coming from every direction at once. There is a moment in the Gilgamesh flood narrative that is rarely quoted, but that carries an almost unbearable weight if you read it carefully. The storm that the gods have sent is so terrible, so far beyond anything they expected, that the gods themselves are overwhelmed by what they have done. The text describes them cowering like dogs on the walls of heaven, weeping, the goddess Ishtar crying out that the days of old had turned to clay. Even the divine beings who ordered the destruction were horrified by it. It is not the behavior of mythological characters going through the expected motions of a flood, myth. It reads like an attempt to convey something that was genuinely beyond language. An event so far outside the range of ordinary human experience that even the powers believed to control the universe could not have fully anticipated what it would look like. And then the waters recede, and Utnapishtim opens the hatch of the vessel, and the sunlight falls on his face, and he weeps. The translation of the original Akkadian text at this moment is strikingly direct. He says he went down on his knees and sat weeping, because in every direction there was nothing but water and silence. The world that had existed was gone. What was left was water and sky, and a mountain peak in the distance, and a vessel, and a handful of survivors, and the terrifying responsibility of beginning again. It is worth asking why that image has survived. The Epic of Gilgamesh was written down on clay tablets in the 2nd millennium BCE, compiled and revised over centuries from older oral and written traditions. It was buried when the great library of Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE during the Assyrian Empire's collapse, and it remained buried, its clay tablets intact under the rubble, for over 2,000 years. It was rediscovered in the mid-19th century by archaeologists excavating the ruins of Nineveh near the city of Mosul in modern Iraq. A British scholar named George Smith was working at the British Museum in 1872 when he first deciphered the flood narrative from the fragments of the tablets, and the story goes that he was so overwhelmed by what he was reading, so astonished to find a pre-biblical flood account written in a language dead for 2 millennia, that he stood up from his desk and began pacing the room, unable to stay still with the weight of what he had just understood. He is said to have become so agitated that he began to remove his clothing, a response so extreme that it has become part of the folklore of Near Eastern scholarship. What George Smith had understood, in that moment of overwhelmed agitation, was something that fundamentally changed the way educated people in the Victorian world understood the Bible and human history. The flood story was not unique to Genesis. It was not an account transmitted only through the Hebrew tradition. It was something far older, preserved in multiple versions across multiple ancient cultures, which meant that the question of where it came from and what it was originally describing was, suddenly, urgently, completely open. That question has been open ever since, and the physical search for evidence has produced some of the most dramatic, contentious, and genuinely curious findings in the history of biblical archaeology. The Shuruppak excavations are a good place to begin with the physical evidence. Shuruppak was an ancient Sumerian city in Mesopotamia, one of the cities mentioned in the Sumerian flood tradition as the home of the flood hero. When archaeologists excavated the site in the early 20th century, they found something beneath the ruins of the later city, a thick layer of water-laid clay sediment, with no cultural material in it, no pottery, no artifacts, no signs of human habitation. Below that layer, there were signs of human settlement from an earlier period. Above it, the later city resumed. The clay layer represented a flooding event significant enough to interrupt habitation at the site, to deposit a thick layer of sediment, and to force a break in the continuous occupation of that place. Similar flood deposit layers have been found at other ancient Mesopotamian cities, including Ur and Kish. The archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated at Ur in the 1920s and 1930s, and found exactly this pattern, what he described as 8 feet of water-laid clay, completely devoid of any human artifact, separating 2 distinct periods of occupation. Woolley was convinced he had found physical evidence of Noah's flood. He sent a telegram to his sponsors at the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania that said simply, "We have found the flood." Later analysis tempered his excitement considerably. Subsequent excavations showed that the flood deposits at different Mesopotamian sites did not correspond to the same date, meaning they represented different local flooding events at different times rather than one simultaneous catastrophic flood across the entire region. But the flood deposits themselves are real. Significant flooding did happen in ancient Mesopotamia, more than once, and the people living there in the 3rd and 4th millennium BCE experienced flooding events serious enough to destroy cities and interrupt the continuous occupation of settlements that had been inhabited for generations. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the defining geographical feature of ancient Mesopotamia, were and remain prone to catastrophic flooding. The land between those rivers is flat and low-lying, with no natural barriers to contain the rivers when they run high. A combination of heavy rainfall, snowmelt from the mountains of Anatolia, where both rivers rise, and the narrow funnel of the Drome River valleys created conditions in the ancient world where floods of extraordinary scale were not just possible, but historically documented to have occurred. A community living on the floodplain of the Euphrates in the 3rd millennium BCE, watching the river rise year after year, experiencing occasional catastrophic inundations that wiped out entire seasons of crops or swept away entire villages, would have understood the concept of a world-ending flood not as mythology, but as lived experience projected forward to its ultimate extreme. What would it look like if the river kept rising and never stopped? What would be left if everything were covered? The answer those ancient communities gave to that question became the Atrahasis epic. And the Atrahasis epic, compiled in Babylonia around 1700 BCE, became a source text for the Gilgamesh flood narrative. And the Gilgamesh flood narrative, along with the earlier Sumerian flood traditions that predated it, became part of the cultural environment within which the Hebrew scribes who wrote and compiled Genesis were working. The borrowing was not plagiarism, and it was not fabrication. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a citation, a recognition that this story belonged to the wider human inheritance, that the flood had been real enough to leave its mark on human memory across centuries and across cultures, and that any serious account of human origins and human relationship to the divine had to reckon with it. The Genesis account itself is, when read closely, not one story, but 2 stories, woven carefully together, a fact that biblical scholars recognized long before the Gilgamesh comparison made it famous. There are small but telling inconsistencies in the Noah narrative that resolve themselves when you understand that 2 originally separate versions of the flood story, from different textual sources that scholars call the Yahwist and the priestly sources, were combined by a later editor. In one version of the Genesis text, Noah takes 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair of every unclean animal onto the ark. In the other version, he takes 1 pair of every animal. In one version, the flood lasts 40 days and 40 nights. In the other version, the entire process from the first rain to the drying of the earth takes a full year. The editor, who wove these 2 traditions together, did a remarkable job of creating a coherent narrative, but the seams are there if you look for them, and they tell a story of their own about how this ancient account was preserved, revised, argued over, and finally settled into the form that billions of people have read for thousands of years. This is not a diminishment of the story. If anything, it is an enlargement. It means that the flood tradition was important enough to exist in multiple versions, carefully preserved and then carefully combined, rather than simply passed down in a single, unquestioned form. It means that the people who preserved it were paying attention to it, wrestling with it, taking it seriously enough to argue about the details. They did not have our evidence of Ice Age sea level changes or our sediment cores from the Black Sea floor. They had something else. They had the living memory of communities that had been through catastrophic flooding. They had the stories that their grandparents had told them, and the stories that those grandparents had received from their own grandparents, going back further than any written record could reach, to a time when the world really had changed under the weight of water, and the question of whether it could happen again was not an abstract theological puzzle, but the most practical question a person could ask. The dimensions of Noah's Ark, as given in the Genesis account, are 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. A cubit was an ancient unit of measurement, roughly equivalent to the length of a forearm, from elbow to fingertip. Typically standardized in the ancient world at somewhere between 18 and 21 inches. Using the most common conversion, 300 cubits works out to approximately 450 feet in length. The Durupinar Formation, that boat-shaped geological structure near Mount Ararat, is 538 feet long. The discrepancy is significant, but the order of magnitude is the same. The ark described in Genesis would have been, if built, one of the largest wooden structures ever constructed by human hands, a vessel larger than any wooden sailing ship known to have been built at any point in history until the era of large 18th and 19th century warships. Naval architects and engineers who have studied the dimensions note that they describe a vessel with a length-to-width ratio of 6:1, which is close to the ratio used in modern ship design for optimal stability in rough water. They also note that the flat-bottomed design described in the text, a vessel meant not to sail anywhere, but simply to float, is extraordinarily well adapted to exactly the purpose described, keeping a large cargo afloat through a catastrophic flood with no need for steering or propulsion. Whether a vessel of those dimensions could actually have housed a breeding population of every species on Earth is the question that has generated more arithmetic and more argument than perhaps any other point in the entire narrative. The number of species currently known to science exceeds 8 million, the vast majority of them insects and other invertebrates. Young Earth creationists who read the Genesis account as a literal historical record have proposed various solutions to the logistics problem, including the argument that Noah's Ark housed representatives of the original created kinds of animals rather than every individual species, and that the biodiversity we see today resulted from rapid speciation after the flood, from those original kinds. This argument has the virtue of reducing the number of animals required, but it requires a rate of evolutionary diversification that would have to be vastly faster than anything observed in nature, creating its own problems. From outside the framework of young Earth creationism, the question looks different. The flood, in the reading supported by geology and comparative mythology, was not a global event that covered every mountain on Earth and destroyed every living thing. It was a catastrophic regional event, or several catastrophic regional events across different parts of the ancient world at different times, each devastating enough to the communities that experienced it to feel like the end of the world. Because for those communities, it was a community whose entire known world was the valley of the Euphrates would have experienced the catastrophic flooding of that valley as the flooding of everything that existed. The ark in this reading was not a vessel large enough to house every species of animal on Earth. It was a vessel large enough to save the seed of the animals a farming community in ancient Mesopotamia depended on, their cattle, their sheep, their goats, their stored grain, the material of their livelihood, and their survival. That vessel is imaginable, it is buildable, and it would have been the most important object in the world to the people who built it and the people who survived on board it. There is a detail in the Gilgamesh version of the flood story that is rarely mentioned, but that speaks to this question of scale with unusual clarity. When Utnapishtim is loading the vessel, Before the flood comes, he loads it with gold and silver, with the seed of all living things, with his family, and with the craftsmen who helped him build the boat. He loads it with things that mattered in a human community, not with species from every continent, not with polar bears and penguins and kangaroos, with gold and craftsmen and seed and family, with the things you would save if you knew your world was about to be destroyed and you had one boat and a limited amount of time. The scale of the story is human, the catastrophe is cosmic, but the response is human, limited, practical, focused on the most essential things, which is, when you think about it quietly in the dark, exactly what any of us would do. The dove in the flood story deserves its own moment. In both the Genesis account and the Gilgamesh version, the flood hero sends out birds to test whether the waters have receded enough for land to be found. In Genesis, Noah first sends out a raven, which goes and comes back. Then he sends a dove, which returns with nothing. He waits 7 days and sends the dove again, and it comes back with a fresh olive leaf in its beak, which tells him that the trees have reappeared, that the earth is drying, that there is something waiting for him out there beyond the water. He waits 7 more days and sends the dove again, and this time it does not come back. It has found somewhere to land, somewhere to stay. The world exists again. The olive leaf is one of the most specific and tender details in the entire Bible, a tiny piece of green in a world of water and mud, carried back to a floating box by a bird that had nowhere else to go. People who study the ancient Mediterranean world note that olive trees are among the most resilient plants in the region, capable of surviving significant flooding and regenerating from roots even when their trunks are destroyed, which would make an olive leaf exactly the kind of evidence you might expect to find first after a flood began to recede. A sign not that the flood was over, but that life was beginning to come back. It is such a specific and observationally accurate detail that it has the texture of real experience rather than mythological invention. The rainbow, at the end of the Noah story, has the same quality. After the flood, after Noah and his family and the animals have come out of the ark onto a drying earth, God appears in the story and makes a covenant with Noah, a promise that the world will never again be destroyed by flood. And the sign of that covenant is the rainbow. What is remarkable about this detail is that it does not function in the narrative as a miraculous invention. A rainbow is a natural phenomenon. It always has been. The story does not claim that God created the rainbow specifically for this purpose. It claims that God pointed to something that already existed in nature and gave it a new meaning. Every time it rains, and the water recedes, and the light returns, the rainbow appears in the sky, and the story says that the rainbow is there to remind both humanity and God of the promise made after the flood. It is a covenant written in light, renewable every time the conditions are right, permanent in the sense that it will keep appearing as long as there are raindrops and sunlight in the time. Atmosphere. For a story that emerged from communities that had experienced catastrophic flooding and lived in fear of it happening again, the promise carried in that image would have been incalculable. Every rainbow they saw was the world saying it again. Not this time. Not again. You are safe for now. There is something worth sitting with about the character of Noah himself. He is not, in the Genesis account, a man of particular charisma or eloquence or heroism in the conventional sense. He is introduced simply as a righteous man, blameless in his generation. He does not argue with God, as Abraham will later argue, attempting to negotiate over the fate of Sodom. He does not flee from his calling, as Jonah will flee. He does not ask for signs or explanations. When he is told to build the ark, he builds it. When he is told to gather the animals, he gathers them. When the door is shut, he stays inside. When he is told to come out, he comes out. He makes a sacrifice, and God responds with the covenant of the rainbow. And then the story is essentially over. Noah lives another 350 years after the flood, long enough in the biblical chronology to be a contemporary of Abraham's grandfather, but those years are summarized in a few verses. He plants a vineyard. He gets drunk. There is a strange and troubling episode involving his sons, and then he dies. It is not the biography of a hero. It is the portrait of an ordinary man who did an extraordinary thing by doing exactly what he was told at exactly the right moment. The ark was not built by a genius or a prophet or a warrior king. It was built by a man who was obedient and who had the skills and the neighbors and the materials to build what needed to be done. There is something quietly radical about that. The survival of the world, in this story, was not accomplished through spectacular displays of divine or human power. It was accomplished through one man, one boat, one family, and a willingness to take an instruction seriously when everyone around him probably thought he had lost his mind. The ancient rabbinical tradition imagined the building of the ark taking 120 years, which is long enough for Noah to have become a subject of mockery in his community, long enough for generation after generation of neighbors to watch him building this enormous vessel in the middle of dry land and shake their heads. The rabbis imagined Noah using the construction process as an opportunity to warn people of what was coming, and the people ignoring him, and the project continuing anyway, until the day the rains came, and the people realized, too late, that the ridiculous old man had been telling the truth. That tradition, though not in the Genesis text itself, has the psychological texture of real human experience. We know how communities treat the people who say something catastrophic is coming and cannot be stopped. We know how hard it is to take an abstract future danger seriously when the present feels stable and familiar. The Islamic tradition has its own version of the Noah story, called Nuh, in the Quran, and it shares the essential elements with the Genesis account, while emphasizing different aspects of the narrative. In the Quranic telling, Nuh warns his people for 950 years before the flood comes. He is rejected, mocked, and dismissed. When the flood finally arrives, one of his own sons refuses to board the ark, certain that he can find safety by climbing to the top of a mountain. Nuh calls to him from the vessel. His son says the mountain will protect him, and the waves come between them. That detail, a father watching his son drown because the son chose certainty over faith, is one of the most heartbreaking moments in the entire flood tradition across any culture, and it is unique to the Quranic account. The ark in Islamic tradition carries the same universal significance as in the Jewish and Christian traditions, but it also carries this particular grief, the reminder that safety offered to everyone is not accepted by everyone, and that proximity to rescue is not the same as rescue. The Vedic flood tradition found in the Hindu scriptures offers a different structural element. In the story of Manu, the first man in the Hindu tradition, and the equivalent in some ways of both Adam and Noah combined, the warning of the flood comes from a small fish. Manu finds the fish in his washing water, and the fish tells him that a great flood is coming, and asks to be protected until it is large enough to survive in the ocean. Manu takes the fish from his washing water and puts it in a jar, and when it outgrows the jar, he puts it in a pond, and when it outgrows the pond, he puts it in a lake, and when it outgrows the lake, he puts it in the ocean. At each stage, the fish grows miraculously, and at each stage, Manu faithfully provides it with a larger vessel. When the flood comes, the fish, now vast, tows Manu's boat to the safety of the northern mountains. The fish then reveals itself to be Brahma, or in some versions, Vishnu, the creator and preserver of the universe. The kindness Manu showed to a small and helpless creature, giving it water and space and protection when it had none, becomes the basis of his salvation. The man who saved the fish is saved by the fish. There is an ethical logic in that structure that feels human in a way that transcends any single religious tradition. The Greek tradition is equally specific. Deucalion, warned by his father Prometheus that Zeus intends to destroy humanity with a flood, builds a chest, a larnax in the Greek, and he and his wife Pyrrha ride it for 9 days and 9 nights, until they come to rest on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, or in some versions, Mount Athos, or in some versions, Mount Othrys. The mountain varies between ancient sources, but the essential structure does not. After the flood, Deucalion and Pyrrha make offerings, and they receive instructions to repopulate the earth by throwing the bones of their mother over their shoulders. They interpret this correctly as the stones of the earth, the bones of the mother goddess Gaia, and as they throw the stones over their shoulders, the stones become human beings, the new race of humanity that lives in the world after the flood. It is a creation myth, nested inside a destruction myth, nested inside a survival myth, the full cycle of ending and beginning compressed into one story. The persistence of these stories is itself a kind of evidence. Human beings forget almost everything. Languages die, customs fade, religions transform into other religions. Cities are built on the ruins of cities, and the people in the upper city often have no knowledge of what lies beneath them, and yet the flood story survived. It survived in cultures that forgot everything else about their origins. It survived through the oral tradition of peoples who had no writing, passed from parent to child across hundreds of generations, without a single written word to fix it. It survived conquest and diaspora, and forced conversion, and the destruction of the libraries that held the tablets it was written on. It is one of the most durable stories the human species has ever told, and that durability seems to demand explanation. The explanation that holds up best, when you weigh all the evidence together in the quiet of a place like this, is the simplest one. The flood story survived because the flood was real. Not one flood, many floods. The rising seas of the Ice Age's end, the catastrophic filling of the Black Sea, the repeated inundations of Mesopotamia's floodplains, the drowning of the Sunda Shelf and the Persian Gulf, and the coastlines of India and the Americas, as the ice continued to melt, and the water continued to rise across 10,000 years of warming. Every community that lived through a catastrophic flood, that watched the water rise above the familiar landmarks, that lost neighbors and animals and stored grain, and built structures to the water, that eventually found dry land again, and began the terrifying process of rebuilding, carried that memory forward. The memory said, the water came. The world almost ended. Someone survived, and that someone carried the seed of everything that mattered into something that could float, and waited for the water to recede, and when the dove came back with a leaf, or the fish towed the boat to the mountain, or the chest grounded on the slopes of Parnassus, the world began again, different from before, marked by what it had survived, but alive. The ship on the seafloor is not yet found. The mountain may still hold its secrets. The Durupinar Formation near Ararat may be a boat, or it may be a fold in the rock, and the soil around it holds marine deposits that have not yet been fully explained. The debate in the scientific literature continues, and will continue, because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, and the question genuinely matters, and real scientists disagree about what the data means. That is not a failure of science. That is science working the way it is supposed to work, carefully, slowly, without rushing to certainty when certainty is not yet earned. What we know, without ambiguity, is this. There was a catastrophic filling of the Black Sea around 7,600 years ago that drowned coastal settlements and forced mass migration. There were catastrophic floods in ancient Mesopotamia, significant enough to interrupt the occupation of cities and deposit thick layers of water-laid sediment that archaeologists still find today. There were 350 flood legends in cultures around the world that share structural similarities deep enough to suggest either direct transmission or independent memory of shared experience. There was an ancient Mesopotamian flood narrative inscribed on clay tablets more than 1,000 years before Genesis that tells the same story with different names. There was a single acre-sized vessel described in the oldest version of that story, sealed with pitch, loaded with the seed of all living things, ridden out on the waters by one righteous man and his family, and brought to rest on a mountain when the waters receded. And then the birds came back, and then one bird didn't, and then a man, who had been floating on a world of water for longer than he could fully comprehend, opened the hatch of his vessel and saw the sky and the mountain and the beginning of everything that came after. Close your eyes now. Let the water recede in your mind, the way it must have receded in every culture that ever told this story, slowly, reluctantly, revealing the muddy outline of a world that had survived. The Tigris is running clear somewhere in the distance. A dove is circling over the olive trees. The air smells like rain that has finally stopped, and like earth that is breathing again, and like the particular freshness that comes at the beginning of things. Everything that matters was saved. Everything that matters is here. You are here, in this quiet place, in this body that carries somewhere in its cells and its memory the entire history of its own survival, all the floods that were ridden out, and the arks that held, and the birds that came back, and the covenants written in light across the sky after the storm. You are what made it through. You are the continuation of a story that is older than language. Let that thought carry you slowly, slowly, into sleep. The question of where Noah lived before the flood is one that scholars have spent generations debating, and the answer is more interesting than most people expect. The Genesis text places the story in a world before the great dispersal of nations, a time when the descendants of Adam still lived in the same region of the ancient Near East, somewhere in or near the land between the rivers. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents in existence, lists a series of kings who ruled before the flood for impossibly long reigns, some in the tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the list says, kingship descended from heaven again, and the reigns became shorter, more human in their length. Scholars interpret the pre-flood section of the king list not as literal history, but as a mythological framework for understanding the transition between a primordial era and the historical world, a before and after built into the structure of recorded time itself. The flood is the hinge between ages. Everything before it is one kind of world. Everything after it is another kind of world. And the man in the boat is the connection between them. The mountains, where the ark came to rest, carry their own archaeology of tradition. Mount Ararat is the most famous candidate, but the Gilgamesh version names a different mountain, called Nemush, in the standard Babylonian version of the text, which scholars have identified, with a peak in the Zagros mountain range, in what is now Kurdistan, far from Ararat. The Sumerian version names a place called Dilmun, which some scholars identify with the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, and some identify with a paradise garden somewhere in the ancient East. The diversity of landing sites in the various flood traditions is not evidence against a real flood, but evidence for the diversity of the traditions themselves. Different communities, if they all experienced catastrophic flooding at roughly the same historical moment, would have each located their ark on the nearest available high ground. The mountains of Ararat, the Zagros Range, the slopes of Parnassus, Mount Pir Omar Gudrun in Iraq, the Himalayas in the Hindu tradition, all of these are the high ground of their respective regions, the places where survivors would naturally have sought refuge, and where the story of survival would naturally have been anchored. The wood of the ark, in the Genesis account, is specified as gopher wood, a Hebrew term that appears nowhere else in the entire Bible, which means scholars genuinely do not know what species it referred to. Various translators have rendered it as cypress, or cedar, or reeds bound together with bitumen, or pine. The Gilgamesh version specifies that the ark was made of wood from a specific forest, coated with vast quantities of bitumen, which is the tar-like substance that occurs naturally in the ancient Middle East and was used extensively in Mesopotamian construction and waterproofing. The use of bitumen is one of the details that places both versions of the flood narrative firmly in the Mesopotamian world, because bitumen occurred naturally along the banks of the Tarb, Euphrates, and was a common building material there, in a way it was not in other ancient cultures. The Hebrew scribes who preserved the Genesis account maintained this detail, which they would have understood as a natural waterproofing material, even if the specific Mesopotamian context it came from had been lost. The animals on the ark have generated more argument than almost any other detail in the gate. Not just the logistical argument about how many species could fit on a vessel of those dimensions. There is a more subtle argument about what kinds of animals the story was originally describing. In the Gilgamesh version, Utnapishtim is told to bring the seed of all living things, an instruction vague enough to encompass almost any interpretation. In Genesis, the instruction is more specific, but internally inconsistent across the two source texts that were combined, reflecting the two traditions we discussed earlier. But in both cases, the emphasis is on preserving what would be needed for life to continue, not on a comprehensive biological survey of every species on Earth. The animals that matter in the story are the animals that mattered in the lives of the people who told it. The cattle and the sheep and the goats and the birds and the wild animals of the ancient Near East. The animals that fed you and clothed you and pulled your plows and filled your fields with the sound of life. There is a zoological detail in the Genesis flood account that is easily overlooked, but that rewards attention. After the waters recede, and Noah and his family and the animals leave the ark, Noah makes a sacrifice to God, burning offerings of every clean animal and every clean bird. And the text says that God smelled the aroma of the sacrifice and was pleased, and the response to that pleasure was the covenant, the promise never to destroy the earth again by flood. The sacrifice functions as the reopening of a relationship that the flood had interrupted, a way of restoring communication between the human world and the divine world after a catastrophe that had appeared to sever it. And what is offered is the animals. The same animals that were saved become the first offering made in the new world. The ark was not just a lifeboat, it was a moving sanctuary for the sacred relationship between humanity and the animals it sought, depended on, a relationship that had to be preserved through the catastrophe in order for anything meaningful to survive. The covenant God makes with Noah after the flood is one of the broadest covenants in all of God Scripture. It is made not just with Noah and his family, but with every living creature that came out of the broad, with the animals and the birds and the creatures of the ground, with all life on earth. It is not a covenant with a chosen people or a single nation. It is a covenant with the entire biosphere, with everything that breathes, with life itself in its full diversity. And the sign of that covenant is placed, not in any temple, or on any altar, or in any human institution. It is placed in the sky, where everyone can see it, where it appears without warning, unrepeatable in its specific form, appearing whenever the conditions of water and light are exactly right. There is something democratic and cosmic about that choice of sign that distinguishes the Noahic covenant from every other covenant in the biblical narrative. This one belongs to everyone. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer famous for finding the wreck of the Titanic at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, turned his attention to the Black Sea in 1999 and 2000, in the aftermath of Ryan and Pittman's flood hypothesis. Using deep-sea robotic vehicles, Ballard and his team surveyed the ancient shorelines of the Black Sea floor and found exactly what the hypothesis predicted. They found an ancient coastline 460 feet below the current surface, complete with structures that appeared to be the remains of ancient human habitation, stone tools and wooden beams, and the kind of structural remnants you find at human settlements, sitting on the ancient lakebed that was drowned when the Bosporus barrier failed. Ballard was cautious in his public statements about what the discovery meant for the flood tradition, but he did say that finding evidence of a catastrophic inundation that drowned human settlements on the Black Sea floor was consistent with the idea that the memory of that event had been preserved in flood legends. He was careful not to claim more than the evidence supported, but what the evidence supported was already remarkable. The sediment cores from the Black Sea tell a layered story that requires careful reading, but, that is, once read, one of the clearest records of environmental catastrophe available from the ancient world. In the cores, you find freshwater organisms in the lower layers, the species that lived in the Black Lake before the inundation. Then there is an abrupt transition layer, a layer where the freshwater organisms disappear and marine organisms begin to appear. Above that layer, you find the species that now live in the Black Sea, saltwater adapted, creatures that moved in from the Mediterranean after the Bosporus barrier failed. That transition is not gradual. In the sediment core, it is a sharp line. Before the line, one world. After the line, another world. The water that changed was not just water. It was the entire ecosystem of an inland sea, transformed in what the geological record suggests was a period of decades or less. The people who lived on the shores of the Black Lake in 5600 BCE, if Ryan and Pittman's chronology is correct, would have watched the land disappear over the course of a single human lifetime, or perhaps less. The stories they told their children would have been about the water coming, and the land going, and everything they had built being lost. Those children would have told their children, and those children would have walked east, following the rivers, carrying their farming knowledge, and their language, and their gods, and their memories, into Mesopotamia, into Anatolia, into the Caucasus, into the world east of the mountains. And somewhere in that long walk, the story of the water that swallowed everything began to crystallize around a single figure, a single boat, a single righteous man who had the warning and the skill and the will to do something about it. Whether that figure was a real historical person, whether there was a specific Noah, or Utnapishtim, or Atrahasis who built a real vessel and survived a real flood, is a question that archaeology cannot definitively answer, and perhaps will never be able to answer. What archaeology can say is that the conditions for generating such a figure existed, that catastrophic floods happened in the ancient Near East, that communities survived them, that some people, in any catastrophic event, make better decisions than others, are better prepared, have more resources, respond more quickly, and survive when their neighbors do not. A community whose leader had the foresight to build a vessel on high ground, or to move to high ground before the flood came, and whose livestock and grain were therefore saved while their neighbors were not, would have survived with a story to tell. And the story they told would have been the story of the man who saw it coming and did something about it, the man who was told and who listened, the man in the boat. The ancient world was full of stories like that. Men and women who saw catastrophe coming and prepared for it, whose preparation looked like madness to their neighbors until the catastrophe arrived and then looked like wisdom. The flood story is the most universal version of that narrative because the catastrophe it describes is the most universal. Drought can be local, earthquake can be local, volcanic eruption can be local, but a flood that comes from everywhere and covers everything, from the rising of a river, or the failure of a coastal barrier, or the catastrophic inrush of seawater into a freshwater basin, is a catastrophe that can happen to any community living anywhere near water, which in the ancient world was every community that had ever existed. Water was life. Water could become death. The man in the boat stands at the knife edge between those two truths. Sleep does not require us to resolve the question. Sleep only asks that we carry it gently. The argument about whether the flood was literal or metaphorical, global or regional, a single event, or a composite memory of many events, will continue in the journals and the non-archaeological reports and the theological seminaries for as long as people care enough about the story to argue about it. And the caring is itself meaningful. The story has been argued about for at least 4,000 years that we know of, probably longer. It has outlasted every empire that tried to control it, and every regime that tried to suppress it, and every century that thought it had finally been explained. It is still here, still carrying water, still carrying the olive branch in the beak of a bird, still carrying the terrifying and comforting knowledge that the world has ended before, and the world survived, and that somewhere in the long chain of survival that connects you to every ancestor you have ever had, someone built something that floated and waited and held on until the waters went down. The light through the water at the end of a flood must be extraordinary. When a flood recedes, the water carries silt and sediment that it deposits everywhere, leaving a layer of rich soil over everything it touched. The ancient Egyptians understood this. The annual flooding of the Nile, which they called the inundation, was not a catastrophe. It was a blessing. The water came and left the black silt of the riverbed across the fields, and in that silt the crops grew. The destructive flood and the generative flood are the same water, doing different things at different scales, at different speeds. The water that Noah's dove flew over was the same water that would eventually become the silt, farmland that fed the next generation of humanity. The catastrophe and the renewal are inseparable. There is a tradition in Jewish scholarship that Noah's name is connected to the Hebrew word for comfort or rest, Naham, in the root form. The text says that his father, Lamech, named him Noah, saying, "This one will comfort us in our labor, and in the painful toil of our hands, arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed." There is a bittersweet logic in naming a child for comfort in a difficult age, not knowing that the child would carry that name through the most catastrophic event in human memory, and out the other side. The comfort he brought was not ease, it was survival. It was the knowledge that the world had been preserved, that the worst had been survived, that life would continue. That is a particular kind of comfort, the kind that does not make the pain go away, but that stands on the other side of the pain and says, "You made it through." The rainbow covenant at the end of the flood narrative is the original form of that comfort, not the promise that hard things will not happen, but the promise that what has already happened will not happen again, not in this exact form, not with this exact totality. The floods will still come, the rivers will still rise, the storms will still build and break, but never again the total dissolution of the known world, never again the water covering everything without exception, never again the silence on the storm, other side of catastrophe that has nothing in it but water and sky, and one man weeping because in every direction there is nothing to see. The raven that Noah sent out first, the bird that went and did not return, is an underappreciated figure in the story. In the Gilgamesh version, the sequence is different: a dove, a swallow, and then a raven, with the raven being the bird that does not return because it has found dry land to walk on and does not need the ark anymore. In Genesis, the raven goes first and simply flies back and forth until the water dries from the berek, which is a different image, a raven suspended between the ark and the not yet visible land, neither staying nor arriving, just flying. The dove is the bird that brings the news. The dove is the bird of peace and good tidings and hope confirmed. But the raven went first, into the unknown, over the water, with no information and no guarantee and nothing but the instruction to go, and it went. There is something worth carrying from that image into sleep. The willingness to go out over the water without knowing what you will find. The story of the flood, in every version it has taken across every culture that has ever told it, is ultimately a story about that willingness, about the people who saw the water coming and built something instead of freezing, about the man who sent out a bird he could not be sure would return, and waited, and sent out another one, and waited again, and eventually received, in the beak of a bird that had been looking for somewhere to land, the smallest possible confirmation that the world still existed. An olive leaf, green and new and still alive, saying, "I am here, come and find me." Let those words settle into you now, in whatever form they take. The world is still here, you are still here. The water, whatever form it has taken in your life, whatever floods of your own you have been riding out, has not covered everything. The dove is still flying. The leaf is still green. Let your body settle into the surface beneath you, the way a boat settles into still water after a long storm. Let the weight of everything you have been holding begin to find its resting place. The covenant is in the sky. The mountain is under your feet. The birds are finding somewhere to land. Rest now. The water has gone down. It is safe to sleep. It has always been safe here, on the other side of the flood, in the world that survived. Let that safety hold you now, as it has held every person who has ever heard this story in the dark, going all the way back to the beginning of the beginning, when the first human voice sat by a fire at the edge of the receding water and began to speak. There are children alive today whose grandparents are the first generation in human history to ground that Noah's story was not unique to the Bible. That is how recently this knowledge arrived. George Smith's discovery in 1872 of the Gilgamesh flood tablet was not ancient news handed down through generations of scholarship. It happened fewer than 200 years ago. Before that, the educated world of Europe and the Americas assumed that the Noah story was singular, that it had no parallel in other traditions, that it was the one account of a real event, preserved by the chosen people of God and recorded in Scripture. The discovery that Mesopotamia had its own flood hero, older than Noah and strikingly similar to him, was one of the great intellectual shocks of the 19th century, comparable in its impact on religious and scholarly thought to Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species 13 years earlier. Both discoveries destabilized the same comfortable certainty. Both sent the educated world into a long argument that has not entirely resolved itself, even now. The argument has not resolved itself because the evidence is genuinely complex, and the questions it raises are genuinely important. What is the relationship between myth and memory? When a story is told and retold for 3,000 years, how much of the original event survives in the telling, and how much has been shaped by the needs and beliefs and aesthetic preferences of the people who did the retelling? Can we use mythology as historical evidence at all? And if so, under what conditions and with what cautions? These are not simple questions. They are questions that historians and archaeologists and literary scholars and cognitive scientists are still working out, using better tools and larger datasets than any previous generation has had access to, and still not arriving at consensus. What the cognitive scientists have contributed to this conversation is particularly interesting. Researchers studying the mechanisms of oral transmission, the way stories are passed from person to person across generations without any written text to anchor them, have found that certain types of story are significantly more durable than others. Stories that carry emotionally intense events, especially events of sudden catastrophic loss, are remembered more accurately and transmitted more reliably than emotionally neutral information. Stories that explain something about the physical world, why the sky is blue, or why floods happen, or where the mountains came from, are remembered and transmitted more reliably than abstract philosophical content. And stories that feature survival, the defeat of a catastrophic threat by a single individual or small group, appear to be among the most persistently retained narrative forms in human memory. The flood story, which is simultaneously a record of catastrophic loss and a celebration of survival, combining the most emotionally intense possible event with the most basic possible outcome, is exactly the kind of story that oral transmission theory would predict to be maximally durable. It is almost perfectly designed, whether by accident or by some deeper principle of narrative selection, to survive the passage of time. The Vedic tradition in India contains a detail about the Manu flood story that is unique among all the flood traditions in the world. When the great fish, who turns out to be the god Vishnu, tows Manu's boat to safety on the northern mountains, it instructs Manu in a body of sacred knowledge, the primordial wisdom of the universe. The flood is not just a destruction and a survival, it is also an initiation. The catastrophe strips away everything unnecessary, everything contingent and temporal, And what is left, what gets into the boat with Manu, is not just the seed of life, but the knowledge of truth itself. After the flood, Manu does not just repopulate the world, he recites the knowledge he received, and that recitation becomes the Vedas, the foundational sacred texts of the Hindu tradition, supposedly transmitted from the divine to the human through the moment of maximum catastrophe. The flood is the occasion for the transmission of ultimate wisdom. The crisis is the teaching. You could read that tradition as pure mythology, the oral tradition of an ancient people making sense of their sacred texts by giving them a cosmic origin story. You could also read it as something more subtle, as the folk wisdom of a culture that understood, from long experience, that catastrophe strips away the inessential and leaves only what truly matters, and that what truly matters is knowledge of how to live, how to honor the divine, how to treat other people, how to understand the world. The Vedic tradition encoded that insight into the flood story itself. The survivor brought wisdom through the water, not just livestock and seed grain. The most important cargo on the ark was not the animals. It was the knowledge of how to be human. The Mayan and Central American flood traditions add yet another layer to the picture. The Quiche Maya Popol Vuh, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian Maya manuscripts, contains a flood narrative embedded in a larger creation mythology. In the Popol Vuh account, the gods create human beings 3 times before getting it right. The first race is made of mud and dissolves in water. The second race is made of wood and is destroyed by a flood, along with the weapons and tools the Complades, wooden people, had misused. The third race is made of corn, the sacred grain of Mesoamerican civilization, and this race is the one that survives and becomes humanity as we know it. The flood in this tradition is not the destruction of an otherwise good creation, but the necessary elimination of an insufficient one. The water does not just destroy, it makes space for something better. The catastrophe is a revision, a chance to try again with better materials. That idea, that the flood is simultaneously a punishment and an opportunity, appears in almost every major flood tradition across multiple cultures. The god of Genesis is destroying a corrupted world and preserving the seed of a better one. The Mesopotamian gods, who send the flood, regret their decision, even as they execute it, which suggests an awareness that what they are eliminating is not simply evil, but something complicated, something that mixed corruption and value in a way that made the decision terrible even when it was necessary. The Maya gods destroy the wooden people not because they are wicked in the way the Genesis narrative implies, but because they are insufficient, not fully formed, not yet the kind of being that can reciprocate the gift of life with gratitude and awareness. The flood in all these traditions is the universe pressing reset, not out of pure destructiveness, but out of something more painful and more purposeful than that. The water that covers everything in the flood narrative is doing something specific that simple destruction would not do. It is making the world equal again. Before the flood, there are cities and hierarchies and accumulated wealth and power, concentrated in the hands of kings and priests. The flood doesn't discriminate based on any of that. The water covers the palace as readily as the hut. The king drowns as certainly as the slave. What the ark saves is not civilization as it was organized before. It is the raw material of life, the animals and the seed and the family and the skills of the craftsman, everything needed to begin again without the accumulated inequalities and corruptions that had developed over centuries. The flood is a reset, not just of the population, but of the social order. What emerges on the other side is a new dispensation, a new covenant, a new start from the most basic possible materials. This is one of the reasons the flood story has been so consistently attractive to religious and political reformers throughout history. It is the ultimate precedent for beginning again. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in the tradition of prophetic Judaism and Christianity, the flood was in the background of the language he used. the waters of justice rolling like a mighty stream. The image of a transformation so total it resembles the deluge, but directed toward liberation rather than destruction. When revolutionary movements throughout history have reached for the language of purification and renewal, they have often reached for flood imagery, the idea of the old, corrupt order being washed away and something new and pure emerging from the water. The flood story is dangerous as well as beautiful, because it can be read as a justification for catastrophic intervention, for the idea that sometimes the only way to fix what is broken is to wash it all away. The history of that reading is not entirely happy. It has been used to justify things that the original story would not recognize as its children. But the covenant is there to check that reading. The rainbow after the flood is not just a symbol of hope, it is a constraint on power. Even the divine power that sent the flood is bound by the covenant not to send it again. The God of Genesis, having seen what total destruction looks like and heard the smell of the offering that came from the survivors, makes a promise that limits what can be done with catastrophic power. The flood sets the precedent. The covenant closes the precedent. Never again will the answer to human failing be total annihilation. Whatever the appropriate response is to a corrupted world, it cannot be that. The rainbow is not just beautiful. It is a legal document. It is the universe agreeing to operate under constraints. The ark itself, in the Christian tradition, has been interpreted for 2,000 years as a figure for salvation, a vessel of divine protection in a dangerous world, a temporary shelter that carries its passengers through the worst possible circumstance to a new beginning. The early church fathers wrote extensively about the ark as a prefiguration of the church, the community of the faithful that carries its members through the flood of history toward the promised shore. That interpretation, whatever you make of its theological claims, captures something true about the function the flood story performs in the human imagination. It is a story about being held in something that floats when everything else is sinking. It is a story about the possibility of protection in the middle of the worst thing that has ever happened. It is a story that the human mind returns to in one form or another, whenever it needs to believe that the worst does not have to be the last. The latest archaeological investigation at the Durupinar site, the work done by the international team in 2024 and 2025, is ongoing. The soil samples have been analyzed, and the findings have been published, and the debate continues. New technology makes it possible to investigate the interior of geological formations without physically excavating them, using ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing methods that did not exist when the site was first studied in the 1950s. The researchers, who believe they are looking at the remains of a real ancient vessel, argue that they have found evidence of internal structure consistent with a constructed object, rather than a natural geological formation. The researchers who believe it is a natural formation argue that the geological processes that formed it are well understood and fully sufficient to explain everything observed. Neither side is obviously wrong. Neither side is obviously right. The site keeps the secret it has been keeping since a Kurdish farmer stumbled across it in 1948 and looked at the boat-shaped hill in his valley and wondered. The wondering is perhaps the most important thing. The fact that human beings keep looking, keep sending expeditions to the slopes of Ararat, keep drilling cores from the Black Sea floor, keep analyzing the soil samples from the Durupinar Formation, keep comparing the ancient Sumerian flood tablets with the Hebrew Genesis account, is a testament to something deep in the human relationship with this story. We need to know if it was real, not just believe. No, the desire for physical confirmation, for the artifact that proves the memory, runs very deep. We want the wood from the ark. We want the sediment layer that matches the date. We want the map of the Black Sea shoreline to align perfectly with Ryan and Pittman's prediction. We want the dove to be a real dove, the olive leaf a real leaf, from a real tree that grew on a real hillside after a real flood. Maybe we want that because the alternative that the story is entirely metaphorical, that it never happened anywhere, in a form that could be physically documented, feels like a loss. As if what the story means can only be fully trusted if what the story describes once actually occurred. But that may be a false equation. The 350 flood traditions around the world are not less meaningful because we cannot definitively trace them to a single catastrophe. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not less powerful because we cannot identify a specific historical Utnapishtim. The dove and the olive leaf are not less beautiful because we cannot find the tree they came from. The meaning of the story is not held hostage to its factual status. It carries its meaning the way the dove carries the leaf, lightly, in the beak, bringing it back, across the water, to the place where someone is waiting and needs to know that the world still exists somewhere beyond the flood. And now the water is very still. All around you, there is nothing but quiet, the particular quiet of after, the quiet that only exists on the other side of something that has been survived. The sky is clearing. The light is the light of a world that has been rinsed clean and is not yet sure what it is going to be. The mountains are there. The valley is beginning to drain. Somewhere, a bird is finding land. Somewhere, the roots of an olive tree are finding soil. Somewhere, a promise is being made in colors, stretched across the sky, between what was and what will be. You have been holding this story for a long time tonight, longer than you knew. Let it go now, the way the ark was let go from the mountain, the way the dove was let go from the window, into the wide air, into the quiet, into the dark that is not frightening because on the other side of it, the morning is already forming, steady and patient and real. You are safe here. The water has gone down. The earth is under your feet, the same earth that carried every flood and survived every flood, and grew new things from the silt that every flood left behind. Sleep now, deeply and well, in the ark of your own life, which is holding you tonight, as it always has, through everything, keeping you afloat on whatever waters have tried to cover you, carrying you safely to the morning.